All right, welcome back. Today we're going to look at monopoly and introduce ourselves to this next market structure. The information is in your book, chapter 14, on the pages indicated. And what we're going to be looking for is trying to identify how a monopolist determines their profit maximizing price and quantity, and determine how to interpret a monopolist graph to see if they're earning a profit or a loss, and compare a little bit between the outcomes of a monopolist versus the outcomes for a perfectly competitive firm. So a couple things to start out with. One is, what is a monopoly and what characterizes a monopoly? And there are a couple of things, or three things, that you need to keep in mind. One is, in monopoly there's only one firm, which makes sense because mono means one, so one firm in an industry and you have a monopoly. That firm will produce unique products available to from nobody else, and there will be lots of barriers to entry, which will keep that industry with just one firm. All of this then means that a firm operating as a monopoly has a lot of market power. They have the ability to control price and quantity, whereas a firm in perfectly competitive markets does not. So remember, a firm in a perfectly competitive market is a price taker, and in a monopoly, the firm is essentially a price maker. They have some control over what that price will be. However, while they may be different in that regard, firms, regardless of the market structure, all share the same thing, and that is the optimum output rule. And that optimum output rule tells us that we will produce up until a point at which marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's going to be the same regardless of the market structure, and so in a monopoly, we will look on a graph and try and identify where marginal cost is and where it intersects marginal revenue, and that will be our optimum output. Before we get to the graph for a monopoly, though, let's just do a quick review on competitive firms. We know that in a perfectly competitive environment, the marginal revenue curve serves not only as marginal revenue, but also the demand curve for an individual firm within the market. And so for a perfectly competitive firm, demand is horizontal and it is fixed at the price. But that's because every firm is offering the exact same thing. In an industry where there's one monopolist, where there's one firm offering goods, then they have market power, and it gives them then the ability to make some choices. And so the demand curve for a monopolist is going to be downward sloping. That also means then that their marginal revenue curve will also be downward sloping. And to try and understand why, let's take a quick look at an example, and let's pretend there's a college bookstore, the Panhandle College Bookstore, and it's a monopolist. There's no one else allowed to sell college clothing for Panhandle University. So in that case, the price will change depending on the quantity demanded. So thinking back to the beginning of the micro course when we looked at the demand curve, we know that a downward sloping demand curve means that as prices drop, the quantity demanded will increase. And if we look, we see that total revenue begins to rise as prices fall, but then begins to drop again. And we remember a little bit about why that is, and we'll get to that in a second. But we also then see that marginal revenue begins to drop for every unit that we sell, and we'll get into why that is the case in just a moment as well. One thing we can see in this chart right away is that unlike perfect competition where price is equal to marginal revenue, we can see that in a monopoly, price tends to be greater than marginal revenue. At least after the first unit sold, that's generally the case. The price will be greater than marginal revenue. Now, the reason why price is greater than marginal revenue and why total revenue begins to rise and then fall goes back to the beginning of the class when we started talking about the demand curve, and we looked at two effects. One is known as the price effect and one is known as the quantity effect. And if you think back to it and remember it, what we said was that when there is a change in price, there's a movement along the demand curve. And there are two things that are at play. One is that as we move down the demand curve, we lose a certain amount of price. That's the price effect. But we then have a gain in the amount of units sold, and that's what we call the quantity effect. So we lose some revenue due to the loss in price. We gain some of that back because of the increase in quantity. And what we know is that the quantity effect will be supreme for part of the demand curve, and the price effect will then have more of an impact on the rest of the demand curve. So at portions of the demand curve where the number of units sold is relatively low, the quantity effect is strong. And then as the price effect takes over, we begin to see total revenue begin to drop. And so for a monopolist, we're going to see that the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping, and that at some point it will actually go from positive to negative, which is different than perfect competition, where marginal revenue never changes. Because the demand is perfectly elastic, marginal revenue is exactly the same for every unit in perfect competition. But in monopoly, we see a continuing decreasing marginal revenue as we sell more units. So if we were to graph a monopolist now, this is what we would see. We would see price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. We would see a downward sloping demand curve just like we have in the market. We would have a marginal revenue curve that lies below the demand curve. It's also downward sloping, and at some point will cross the horizontal axis. And in fact, the marginal revenue curve will cross the horizontal axis at the point at which the demand curve is unit elastic. And so now we're ready to begin to look at a monopolist and begin to identify their profit maximizing quantity and price. And again, just as a reminder, the optimum output rule tells us for any firm, regardless of market structure, that the best place to produce is where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So let's take a look at an example. And then in this example, you're going to see in the book that there are two types of ways that they show monopolists. One is where they're going to pretend that marginal costs and average total costs are consistent and constant, which would make them a horizontal line, and you'll see them the way that you've been working with them in the past. So for this example, we're going to assume that marginal cost is equal to average total cost and that they are constant, which gives us a horizontal line here. And in a case like this, what we would say then is the optimum output is where this marginal cost curve hits the marginal revenue curve, which is at 3 units. At 3 units, the demand price, the price that consumers are willing to pay, is $14. So if marginal cost is 10, then we're going to produce 3 units at a price of $14, which would give then a profit to the monopolist of $4 per unit times the 3 units sold. So we would be looking at a profit here of $12 for the monopolist. If this were a perfectly competitive firm, then we would see that the marginal revenue curve would not exist here. The marginal revenue would be the same as demand, because that's what we know is that in perfect competition, the demand curve is equal to price, which is equal to marginal revenue. And so we would treat this demand curve as a marginal revenue curve, and we would produce where it crosses the marginal cost curve. So if we were in perfect competition, we would be producing 5 units. And because marginal revenue equals marginal cost and price equals average total cost, then at this point there would be 0 economic profit. And so if we were to compare monopolies to perfect competition, we could say a couple of things. One is that monopolists will produce less than a perfect competitor, that the quantity of a monopolist is less than the quantity for competition, and that monopolists will be operating at higher prices than perfect competition. So the price of a monopolist is greater than the price for a perfect competitor. And finally, we can say that monopolists will earn a profit in the long run, whereas for a perfect competitor, they do not. So for a monopolist, profit is greater than 0, whereas for a perfect competitor, profit is equal to 0. We'll take a look at just another example, this time with more conventional cost curves. So we can take a look again, and we can say if we have conventional cost curves like we're used to with the U-shaped average total cost and a swooshing marginal cost curve, the same thing still applies. In this case, marginal cost would cross marginal revenue, and that's the quantity I would sell at if I were a monopolist. I would then take that quantity and go straight up till I hit the demand curve, and that would be the price that I would be charging. And so the area of profit would be this box here, from the monopolist price across to the demand curve, down to average total costs, and back across again. And this would be our profit level. And again, if we wanted to look at another example, again, we would say that if I were a monopolist, I would look for marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and at that point I would go down and say that that's my quantity for the monopolist. And then to find price, I would then continue up until I hit the demand curve and then work across, and that would be my price. So my revenue would be this red box. I would then look and see my average total costs, where it hits the average total cost curve, and back across. And so this bottom box here would be my costs. And because my total costs are less than my total revenue, then I can call this area here my profit. And what we know then is that monopolists will operate at a profit in the long run, and that they will be producing less than we would have in perfect competition, and they'll be producing at a higher price. One more thing to keep in mind in this graph is comparing monopolists to the efficient output, where we can not make anyone better off without making someone worse off. And in that case, where we're maximizing producer and consumer surplus, we want to find the spot or the place on the graph in which the willingness to sell is equal to the willingness to pay. In that case, that's where marginal cost intersects with the demand curve. It's at this point where we have market efficiency. And so we see that the monopolist produces less than the efficient level and at a higher price. That also means then that this little area between the monopolist price and the efficient price, below the demand curve and above the marginal cost curve, indicates for us this area right in here is our lost efficiency due to a monopoly, and that lost efficiency is what we call dead weight loss. We'll do some more work on graphs with monopoly and some more problems when you come into class next time. Until then, I will see you soon. Bye.